3 disturbing and true horror stories about storms. The storm is coming. Have you ever felt that inexplicable fear when the wind starts to howl and the shadows grow darker? Sometimes the sounds of rain and thunder are more than just a natural phenomenon. They can be the omen of something much darker, something that challenges our understanding. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to be trapped in a dark place with the only light coming from violent lightning, not knowing what's lurking? What if I told you that these horror stories are not just fiction? They really happened amidst storms that were never forgotten. Tonight I'm going to tell you 3 disturbing accounts of people who faced terror in the heart of the most intense storms. What seemed like just a weather event turned into a psychological nightmare, where the fear of the unknown becomes a threat far more terrifying than the darkness itself. Do you have the courage to uncover what's behind each thunderclap and lightning strike? Could you face the panic of being alone, surrounded by the fury of nature and something much darker? Get ready, because these stories will mess with your mind. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear might make you rethink how you face storms next time. It's not just the sound of rain. It's something much more unsettling. Let's begin. Story 1. The Lighthouse of Despair. Michael and Sarah pulled up to the rugged coast just as dark clouds began to swallow the sky. The towering lighthouse loomed above them, its silhouette cutting sharply against the dimming light. It had been a spontaneous decision to visit the lighthouse, a local attraction with a reputation for being eerie but stunning. As they walked closer, the sea breeze grew colder, prickling Sarah's skin with a sense of unease. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, glancing at Michael, who seemed unaffected by the oppressive atmosphere. He gave her a reassuring smile and took her hand. "It's just an old lighthouse," he replied with a chuckle. "We'll have a quick look around before the storm hits." But as they approached the entrance, Sarah felt a strange, heavy pull, as if the lighthouse itself were somehow aware of them. The first rumble of thunder echoed over the sea, and a chill slid down her spine. Ignoring the growing discomfort, they pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air was thick, carrying the salty, damp scent of aged stone and rusted metal. The dim interior seemed to close in around them, amplifying every sound. Another roll of thunder reverberated outside, closer this time. With the storm bearing down, Michael and Sarah had no choice but to stay put, unaware of the nightmarish encounter that awaited them within the walls of the old lighthouse. The storm escalated outside, each gust of wind rattling the lighthouse's walls as if the structure itself was alive, shuddering in protest. Michael tried to brush it off with a laugh, but the sound fell flat in the echoing chamber. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, unable to shake the chill that had settled deep inside her. "We should just wait it out," Michael suggested, trying to sound casual, though his voice carried an edge of tension. They made their way to a narrow stairwell leading up to a small room with a window. From here, they could see the raging sea, waves crashing violently against the rocks below. Lightning flashed, illuminating the swirling clouds and casting long shadows across the walls. As they waited, the light in the room flickered, dimming with each roll of thunder. Sarah tried to steady her breathing, but an inexplicable sense of dread gnawed at her. She glanced at Michael, who was peering out the window, seemingly transfixed by the view. Then, abruptly, the light went out, plunging them into darkness. The silence that followed was dense, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of the rain and distant thunder. In the darkness, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as if the lighthouse itself were amplifying her fear. She reached for Michael's hand, gripping it tightly, and whispered, "Something feels wrong here." For a moment, the two stood in silence, listening to the relentless storm outside and the thick, pulsing darkness within. Then, as if in answer to Sarah's fear, a faint but steady thumping sound began to echo from above. Michael stiffened beside her. "Did you hear that?" Before she could answer, the sound repeated, slow, deliberate footsteps pacing in the room at the top of the lighthouse. Each step sent vibrations through the floor, like someone pacing in frustration or longing. Sarah's grip on Michael's hand tightened as a cold fear crept into her chest. Maybe it's just the wind, Michael said, his voice shaky, more trying to convince himself than her. But as the footsteps grew louder, neither of them believed that anymore. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and dread, Michael pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight, casting its narrow beam up the spiral staircase. "Come on," he whispered, though every nerve in Sarah's body wanted to run the other way. Together, they climbed the creaking stairs, their footsteps barely audible beneath the persistent thumping above. But when they reached the top, the room was empty. Nothing but shadows filled the narrow space, and an eerie silence settled around them, broken only by the storm raging outside. Then, as they turned to descend, Sarah froze. A light had appeared below them, shining from the very room they had just left. Trembling, she looked at Michael, who wore the same expression of disbelief and growing terror. Sarah and Michael hurried back down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the lighthouse. The light they'd seen was gone by the time they reached the bottom, leaving only the shadowed room and the muffled howling of the storm outside. Desperate to understand what was happening, they began to search the room for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. Sarah's hand brushed across an old, dust-covered drawer near the wall. Inside, she found a tattered notebook, its pages faded and brittle. She opened it, squinting to make out the handwritten entries. "It's a logbook," she murmured, "from someone named Henry. Looks like he was the lighthouse keeper." Michael leaned closer as she flipped through the pages. The entries were scattered but filled with observations about storms, shipwrecks, and long, solitary nights. One entry, in particular, caught their attention, the account of a massive storm that had occurred years ago. As she read, Sarah felt her heart pound faster. According to the log, Henry had spent his final night alone in the lighthouse, signaling to a ship struggling in the storm. The ship never arrived, and Henry's body was discovered the next day, clutching his lantern as if still trying to signal the lost vessel. A cold shiver ran down her spine. "It's like he never stopped trying to save that ship," she whispered. "Maybe he's still here." Michael didn't answer, but the look in his eyes mirrored her fear. Somehow the presence they sensed felt like a desperate echo of the past, a spirit unable to let go. The wind howled louder as the storm reached its peak, battering the walls of the lighthouse and rattling the windows. Sarah and Michael could hardly hear each other over the roar, but neither dared to break the silence. A sense of anticipation filled the room, as if something or someone was waiting for them to act. Then, in the brief flash of lightning outside, they saw him. At the very top of the lighthouse staircase stood a spectral figure, his silhouette outlined by the storm. He was an older man, drenched and exhausted, holding a lantern in one hand and looking out over the sea with a gaze that seemed endless and lost. His eyes, fixed somewhere beyond them, held a haunting desperation. "Henry," Sarah whispered, feeling an ache of sorrow mingled with her fear. She could almost feel his anguish, his unyielding need to finish his final duty. The ghostly figure began to raise his lantern, lifting it toward the sea as if trying to signal a ship through the raging storm. Michael pulled Sarah close, but she didn't resist. She was transfixed, drawn in by the figure's tragic persistence. The relentless wind seemed to echo Henry's agony, his unfulfilled purpose echoing through the lighthouse. "We need to help him," Sarah said suddenly, a strange certainty in her voice. "We have to do what he couldn't. Maybe then he'll finally be at peace." Michael hesitated, but seeing the resolve in her eyes, he nodded. With trembling hands, Sarah took a lantern from a shelf nearby, wiping the dust off its cracked glass. She lit it, feeling a strange calm settle over her as the warm glow illuminated her face. Michael watched, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, but he stayed silent, trusting her instinct. They climbed the stairs once more, their footsteps echoing in the hollow tower. The ghostly figure of Henry seemed to fade as they approached, his desperate gaze fixed on the endless expanse of stormy sea outside. Sarah lifted the lantern, mimicking his final gesture, and began to wave it in slow, deliberate arcs, just as Henry might have done all those years ago. As she moved the lantern, a profound silence fell over the lighthouse. The wind outside seemed to soften, the storm's fury subsiding bit by bit, as if the raging forces were finally appeased. Sarah's arm grew heavy, but she kept signaling, feeling as though she was somehow completing Henry's unfinished task. She whispered softly, almost like a prayer, "You can rest now." In that moment, Henry's figure flickered, then slowly dissipated, the last traces of his form dissolving into the night. The air around them grew lighter, the tension releasing as if a great weight had been lifted. Sarah lowered the lantern, exhaustion washing over her, but her heart felt strangely full. Michael put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he murmured, and together they stood in silence, listening to the calming whispers of the waves below. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft golden light over the now calm sea. The storm had passed, leaving the lighthouse standing still, almost serene in its quiet aftermath. Michael and Sarah stood on the small balcony outside the lighthouse, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The air was crisp and the waves were gentle, a stark contrast to the chaos they had witnessed the night before. They didn't speak much on their descent from the lighthouse, both lost in their thoughts, the weight of the events still lingering in the silence between them. As they reached the base of the tower, Sarah stopped, her gaze drifting back to the towering structure. She felt a pull, an unshakable connection to the place that had been both a sanctuary and a prison for Henry's spirit. "Do you think he's really gone?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but it feels different, doesn't it? Like something shifted." Just as they turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind kicked up, carrying with it a faint, mournful wail. Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. For a split second, she thought she saw the faint outline of a figure atop the lighthouse, waving a lantern across the sea, just as it had been the night before. But when she blinked, it was gone, vanished into the mist. She swallowed hard, shivering despite the warmth of the day. Maybe he'll never stop. Michael took her hand, his grip firm. "Maybe not," he said softly, "but at least he's not alone anymore." And as they walked away, the lighthouse behind them stood silently, its light now steady and unwavering, a beacon for those lost at sea and for the spirit of a man who had found peace at last. Story 2: The Ghost Storm of the Cove. Ben stepped off the bus, breathing in the familiar salty air that hung heavy around the coastal village he once called home. The weather was shifting quickly. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, making the small, weather-beaten houses along the shore look even older. Despite the years, nothing here seemed to have changed. It was as if time had simply stopped. Ben hadn't been back since he left in his teens, haunted by memories of the storm that swept through, leaving scars on the town and its people. As he walked through the narrow streets, he noticed how the few elderly residents he recognized avoided his gaze. A couple of them stood on their doorsteps, watching the ocean, their expressions blank and withdrawn. He remembered how they used to warn him about the sea's call and the ghost storm, but he'd brushed it off as superstition, something for the older generations to whisper about. Now, years later, he felt a strange pull, as though the village itself wanted him back. Ben spotted Mrs. Thompson, a long-time resident he remembered from his childhood, standing by her front porch. Her face was weathered, eyes fixed on the darkening sky with a distant, almost reverent look. As he approached her, she glanced at him and muttered, "It's almost time again. You feel it, don't you?" He nodded, not sure what to say. He did feel it. A tightening in his chest, an unspoken fear rising with the wind. The air grew colder, and the smell of rain was thick, almost overwhelming. Mrs. Thompson gave him one last look and turned to her door, leaving Ben alone with the unsettled feeling that had followed him since he arrived. The wind picked up as Ben continued through the village, and each gust carried with it an eerie whisper that almost sounded like distant voices. He dismissed it as his imagination, the nerves of being back here after so long. But the more he tried to shake it off, the stronger the sensation grew. Passing an old, cracked window, Ben noticed something odd, a wet handprint on the glass. The mark seemed fresh, as though someone had just pressed their palm there, yet there was no one around. The print was smeared, water trickling down in thin, crooked lines that looked almost like tears. He hesitated, studying it for a moment, a chill running down his spine. How could there be water here? The rain hadn't even started yet. A low rumble sounded from the sky, and Ben looked up to see the storm clouds creeping closer. The village was quiet, too quiet. The younger residents had evacuated, leaving behind only the older villagers, the ones who had grown up with tales of the ghost storm. They seemed to know something the others didn't, something unspoken, yet understood among those who'd stayed. He continued walking, the silence around him broken only by the occasional creak of a door or the flap of an old sign in the wind. Near the edge of town, he passed a small group of elderly men and women huddled together, their heads down, whispering to one another. They didn't acknowledge him, but he caught a few words. The sea always returns, and no escape. Ben shivered, gripping his coat tighter. The air felt thick with tension, and his memories of the last storm surfaced unbidden, the terror and confusion of that night flooding back. Something was wrong here, deeply wrong, and he could no longer tell if it was just his mind playing tricks or if the village itself was trying to warn him. The storm rolled in with a vengeance that night, rain beginning to pelt the rooftops, and Ben lay awake in the dim light of his rented room. Outside, the howling wind seemed to call to him, rising and falling like voices trapped in the dark. It was no ordinary storm. It felt alive, watching, waiting. Unable to shake the feeling, Ben rose from bed, pulling on his coat and boots. Something urged him toward the shore, as though an invisible thread guided his steps. When he reached the beach, he paused, staring out at the dark, churning sea, its waves swelling higher and crashing violently against the rocks. Lightning flashed, illuminating the coastline, and for a brief, chilling moment, he thought he saw figures standing along the shore. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The shapes weren't fully solid, as if they were made of mist and shadow, caught somewhere between worlds. Yet they were there. Vague, familiar faces from his past, people he hadn't seen in years. His childhood friend, Jimmy, who had vanished during that stormy night long ago. Old Mr. Landry, who came back after a storm, silent and changed. A sharp gust sent cold rain slicing into his face, pulling him from his frozen shock. The figures seemed to shift, glancing toward him with hollow eyes that held both recognition and sorrow. Ben's legs felt rooted to the spot as a voice, soft and thin as a whisper, drifted to him over the waves. Ben, Ben. The hairs on his neck stood up as he recognized the voice. It was his mother's, gone now for years. He took a step back, nearly slipping in the wet sand. Was he dreaming, or had he truly heard her? The whispers grew louder, blending into the crash of the sea, each wave seeming to echo with voices from his past, calling his name, begging him to come closer. The rain fell harder, lashing against Ben's face as he staggered back, desperate to escape the spectral figures along the shore. But as he turned, he felt something pull him back, a force as relentless as the sea itself. He looked down, seeing fresh footprints in the wet sand, his own, side by side with prints that shouldn't have been there. He wasn't alone. Another flash of lightning lit up the beach, and he saw them more clearly now. The ghostly faces, eyes empty, lips moving in a silent plea. Jimmy, Mr. Landry, his mother, all bound to this place, trapped in the endless cycle of the storm, the same storm that had brought him back, the storm that never truly left. A wave crashed near his feet, sending a spray of salt water up his legs. He stumbled back, but the pull grew stronger, and in the fleeting light of another strike, he saw his mother reaching out to him. Her face was twisted in an expression he couldn't quite read, sadness, fear, and something else. "Ben, it's time," she murmured, her voice merging with the howl of the wind. Panicking, he turned to run, but the sand seemed to drag him down, his boots sinking deeper with each step. His breaths came in ragged gasps, mingling with the whispers that grew louder, pleading, accusing. The villagers' stories about the ghost storm filled his mind. Was he destined to join them, another soul claimed by the sea, eternally bound to return? "Let me go," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. But even as he fought, a part of him felt a deep, unexplainable familiarity with this place, this moment, as if he, too, had been part of this before. At the first light of dawn, the storm's fury finally began to wane. The winds died down, and the waves receded, leaving the beach eerily still. Ben lay sprawled in the sand, soaked and shivering, unsure of how long he had been there. His limbs felt heavy, and when he tried to push himself up, he felt a strange ache in his hands and feet, as though they'd been gripped tightly by something cold and unyielding. Staggering to his feet, he glanced around. The beach was empty, the figures from the night before gone as though they'd never been there. But the memory of their hollow eyes and outstretched hands lingered, and he could still hear faint whispers echoing in his mind. He looked down, noticing faint salty marks on his palms and the tops of his boots, the remnants of the sea's hold on him. As he made his way back through the village, he saw a few elderly residents standing outside their homes, watching him with expressions of wary understanding. Mrs. Thompson was among them, her face lined with sorrow. She met his gaze, a knowing look in her eyes, and gave him a slow, somber nod. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked softly. Ben could only nod, feeling an unsettling connection to her and the others who had stayed behind. He realized that he now bore the same silent mark they did, the mark of someone who had faced the ghost storm and come back altered. He was part of this cycle now, bound to the village in ways he couldn't explain. As he walked toward the edge of town, he glanced back one last time. The sky was clear, but a faint rumble lingered, as if another storm was already forming somewhere in the distance, waiting for its chance to return. Ben shivered, knowing he could never truly escape. Months passed, but Ben could not shake the lingering weight of that night. He'd returned to his life in the city, trying to immerse himself in routine, but the village and the storm haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces, their hollow, pleading eyes, and the faint touch of his mother's hand, pulling him back into the depths of his memory. Sometimes, as he drifted off to sleep, he'd hear the sea's call. It was distant, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. He'd awaken in a cold sweat, the memory of the storm alive in his mind, always feeling the pull, the weight of a promise yet unfulfilled. One evening, he received a letter from Mrs. Thompson. It was brief, written in the careful, shaky script of someone who knew the weight of what she had to say. "The storm will come again. Some things never truly leave us." Ben folded the letter carefully, realizing that the pull he felt wasn't fading. It was growing stronger. The ghost storm was part of him now, a bond he could never sever. He knew that one day he would return, drawn back to that village, to the cycle that called to him just as it had to those before him. Outside, the wind began to pick up, and he could have sworn he heard his name, soft as a whisper carried on the breeze. Story 3. The storm on the lake. Mason and Emily had grown up in the small mountain town near Whisper Lake. Surrounded by dense forest, the lake had a quiet, eerie charm, its calm waters a mirror to the sky above. The townspeople often spoke of strange things seen and heard by the lake, especially during storms. Though they'd always heard the tales, Mason and Emily brushed them off as superstitions, stories to keep kids away from the deep, dark waters. But that night, something felt different. A severe storm was forecasted, and Emily's curiosity got the better of her. She suggested they stay overnight at an old, abandoned cabin on the lake's edge. Mason, craving a break from routine, agreed with a laugh. They gathered flashlights, a few snacks, and made their way through the darkening forest. Just as they were leaving, an elderly man they barely knew from town caught sight of them and approached. He looked at them with a gaze sharpened by years of secrets. "You don't want to be near that lake tonight," he warned, his voice low and gravelly. "When the waters rise, so do the spirits of those who've been lost beneath." Mason tried to laugh it off, but the man's words had a chilling effect on Emily. She glanced at Mason, uneasy but still determined. Shrugging off her hesitation, they continued their walk to the cabin. As they reached the lake's edge, an unsettling silence hung over the water. Not even a breeze stirred the trees, and a strange tension filled the air, like the lake was watching, waiting. The cabin stood at the edge of the lake, weathered and forgotten, blending into the night. Mason and Emily pushed open the creaky door, stepping into a room filled with dust and the faint scent of damp wood. They settled in, pulling two old chairs close to the window overlooking the lake, eager to watch the storm as it unfolded. Outside, the air felt thick, and an unnatural calm settled over the water. Mason felt a growing sense of unease but brushed it off, not wanting Emily to see his nerves. He shot her a grin. "Guess that old man's stories are getting to me." Emily forced a laugh, but the unease gnawed at her. As she looked out across the lake, her gaze lingered on the water. It seemed darker than usual, almost black, as though it held secrets within its depths. Her mind drifted to the local stories, the whispers of a village drowned under these waters when the lake was formed. No one really knew how many lives were lost when the valley flooded. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the air, and the sky flashed with a faint light. Emily jumped, clutching her flashlight tighter. "Storm's here," Mason said, though his voice held an edge he hadn't intended. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in around them. Emily glanced back at the lake and felt a chill creep down her spine. She could have sworn she saw something moving just below the surface, something that vanished as quickly as it appeared. But before she could say anything, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, and the sky darkened completely. The rain fell hard, drumming on the roof of the cabin and drowning out the quiet sounds of the forest. Flashes of lightning cast fleeting light across the lake, illuminating the water in stark, unnatural brightness. Emily sat tense by the window, her eyes fixed on the lake's surface. For a moment, in one of the flashes, she thought she saw a shadow moving across the water. "Mason, did you see that?" she whispered, barely able to tear her gaze away. "See what?" he asked, glancing over but sounding unconvinced. "There." She pointed toward the lake. It looked like someone standing just below the water. Her voice shook slightly, and Mason frowned, trying to mask his own rising fear. "Probably just the wind moving things around," he muttered, but even he didn't believe it. A flash of lightning lit up the lake again, and this time both of them saw it. Dark, indistinct shapes seemed to hover just beneath the surface, wavering and shifting with the water. Emily felt her heart race as she recognized what looked like faces staring back at her. Distorted, sorrowful faces, twisted with pain and anger. The storm intensified, and a low, hollow sound, almost like a moan, echoed from the lake, rising with each crack of thunder. Mason stood, trying to rationalize the creeping dread filling him. But Emily was transfixed, unable to look away from the lake's unnatural scene. In that moment, she heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the storm. It was her name, spoken with a chilling familiarity, calling her toward the water. Lightning crackled, illuminating the cabin in brief bursts. Mason stumbled back from the window, finally shaken by the apparitions in the water. Desperate to break the unsettling silence between them, he rummaged through the dusty shelves of the cabin, trying to distract himself. As his fingers brushed against a brittle, yellowed stack of papers, he pulled one free, a crumpled newspaper. "Look at this," he said, his voice hoarse. Emily turned reluctantly from the window, drawn to the faint text and grainy images. The newspaper headline read, "Local village submerged in tragic lake expansion. Lives lost." A shiver ran down her spine as she skimmed the story, which detailed the intentional flooding of a valley that had once been home to a small indigenous village. The lake now lay where their homes and burial grounds once stood, and the villagers' remains were never recovered. Emily's gaze returned to the lake, a newfound understanding settling over her. "They're still here," she whispered, horrified. "Those figures, those faces we're seeing, they're the people who died when the lake was created." Mason's face paled as he absorbed her words. The story he'd brushed off as superstition was real. The lake wasn't just water. It was a graveyard, filled with souls disturbed by the storm. "We need to leave," he stammered, his voice a mix of fear and urgency. But as they reached the cabin door, a sudden gust slammed it shut. A strange pull seemed to hold them in place, as if the lake itself refused to let them go. Emily looked back at the window, sensing that something beyond her control was determined to keep them near the water. The storm raged on, and every flash of lightning revealed the figures drawing closer to the cabin. The faces in the water had taken shape, pale and dripping, with eyes hollow and searching. Emily's breath caught as she watched them approach, their outstretched hands rising from the lake, reaching toward the shore and toward the cabin. "Mason!" she shouted, her voice trembling. He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but the force seemed to grip them tighter with every desperate attempt to escape. Suddenly, the cabin floor shuddered, and they stumbled back, their footing unsteady. Another flash of lightning cast a haunting glow over Mason's face. He turned to Emily, eyes wide with terror. "They're not going to let us go, are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Emily could respond, an invisible force pulled Mason toward the cabin door, as if summoned by the spirits outside. She clutched at his hand, desperately trying to hold on, but her grip was slipping. His face twisted in terror as he was dragged out, his body slipping through her fingers and out into the rain-soaked night. "Mason!" Emily screamed, her voice drowned by the thunder as she watched him disappear toward the lake, his silhouette vanishing beneath the dark, churning water. In the eerie silence that followed, the rain eased and the lake grew calm once again. Emily collapsed, her chest heaving, her mind unable to comprehend what she had just witnessed. She was alone, left with the hollow ache of loss and the haunting knowledge that Mason's spirit, too, might now linger beneath the surface.